I'd like to introduce Rachel Adamski and David Seaton with Harmony Biosciences. For those of you who don't know, or I think most of you who are here tonight do know, that Harmony has been enrolling participants in the phase 3 study for pitolisant to evaluate excessive daytime sleepiness in Prader-Willi syndrome. They are new to the PWS space over the last couple of years, but not new to the world of rare disease. And I'd like to give Rachel and David an opportunity to introduce themselves, and then we can get right into it.
Thank you so much, Dorothea. It's an honor to be here tonight with the caregivers and folks on the call in the PWS community. The team at Harmony, as Dorothea said, we've been working alongside PWSA for the past 4 or 5 years as we've explored pitolisant in a phase 2 and now phase 3 trial for people living with Prader-Willi syndrome and excessive daytime sleepiness. So Dave and I are going to give a short presentation on the phase 3 clinical trial, and then we're happy to answer any questions you all might have. I am going to share my screen. Okay, and I'm going to assume you guys can see my slides. So what we're going to talk about tonight, as I mentioned, is the clinical study that we call TEMPO. And that's the short name for the long name that you see there, the phase 3 randomized double-blind placebo-controlled efficacy and safety study of pitolisant, followed by an open label extension. And so if you want to take a screenshot of this or scan this QR code, where the QR code will take you is to tempopwsstudy.com, and that is our website for the clinical trial. So what we're going to present to you today is kind of high level on the clinical trial, but you can have a lot of more details found on the website. And then we'll give you an email address at the end as well, so you can reach out to us at any time. But if you haven't heard of Harmony Biosciences, we are a small pharmaceutical company based outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We have about 300 employees now that are working all in rare neurological drug development. We do have one approved product. It is Wakix, which is also known as pitolisant, the scientific name, that's approved in both children and adults living with narcolepsy. We're also studying pitolisant in other rare neurological diseases like Prader-Willi syndrome. And David will talk a little bit more about why we are looking at pitolisant in PWS. But one of the core tenets of what we do here at Harmony is hopefully to infuse empathy along with innovation. And it's very important to us to work alongside groups like PWSA, USA, and other advocacy groups and organizations as we develop medications that will hopefully one day benefit your family and others in the rare disease community. So just to level set, because I don't want anyone to kind of come into this, I've said clinical trial, clinical study a couple of times. I don't want anyone to be confused about what we're talking about. And then, of course, apologies to folks who already know this. The PWS community is very well versed in clinical trials, but just to level set, so what a clinical trial or a clinical research study is, it's conducted to learn whether an investigational medication is safe or effective for use in the medical condition being studied. And we have to follow strict scientific standards to help ensure the safety of participants while we study the medication. And what is an investigational medication? So you've heard me use the term pitolisant several times. So pitolisant is the investigational medication that we at Harmony are studying. And our clinical trial that we've designed has been approved by the US Food and Drug Administration for the treatment of the condition being studied. So our clinical trial has been approved by the FDA for us to study pitolisant in people living with PWS. So Dave, can you talk a little bit more about why we're studying pitolisant in people living with PWS?
Sure will. Thank you, Rachel. And I just want to thank everybody for allowing me this opportunity to speak with all of you. Again, my name is Dave Seiden, and just a little background on who I am. I'm Senior Medical Director for Clinical Development at Harmony. I'm an adult neurologist by training and an adult sleep specialist. So I'll tell you that since joining Harmony, I've learned quite a bit about Prader-Willi syndrome. It's not something that you learn a lot about in medical school. And I think during my about 30 years of practice, I saw in my practice, just because of the nature of the practice as an adult sleep specialist, I maybe saw a handful of people with Prader-Willi syndrome. So as I said, I've learned quite a bit from not only my medical colleagues, but from the Prader-Willi syndrome community in general. It's been a real pleasure working with everyone. So thank you. So just a little bit about Prader-Willi syndrome and pitolisant. Pitolisant, also known as Wakix, that is our one commercialized product that Harmony has on the market, and it's on the market for both adults and children with narcolepsy, which is a central disorder of hypersomnia, which some of you may know something about, because interestingly, many people with Prader-Willi syndrome actually have narcolepsy-like features as part of their syndrome. But generally, when you think about Prader-Willi syndrome, fundamentally, it is a disorder of hypothalamic dysfunction. What does that mean? Well, the hypothalamus is a gland that sits in the middle, at the lower part of the brain, and is involved in many physiological functions in the human body, including regulation of hunger and satiety, sleep-wake states, release of growth hormone and other endocrine functions, and metabolism. So if you think about it, when that gland is dysfunctional, you see many of the symptoms that people with Prader-Willi syndrome experience, like excessive daytime sleepiness, hyperphagia, mood disturbances, and so forth. Importantly, from our standpoint, from the standpoint of Harmony, because of the drug that we are studying called pitolisant, it's the regulation of sleep-wake stability by the hypothalamus is very important. The hypothalamus does this via the interaction of a number of neurochemicals, including something called hypocretin, also known as orexin, and histamine, as well as some of the other what we call monoaminergics, like norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine, some of the things you've heard of. And it's these neurotransmitters and neuropeptides, act in concert with other chemicals to keep the brain awake. Pitolisant, which is the medication that we're studying, basically acts by increasing histamine levels. And when you increase histamine levels, you increase wakefulness. And we all know, or some of us know, that excessive daytime sleepiness is a significant issue in patients with Prader-Willi syndrome. And the hope is that pitolisant is going to help with that particular symptom. Next slide. So let me just tell you a little bit about trials. I mean, Rachel alluded to some of this, but there are different phases of clinical trials, starting with phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. We have already done both phase 1 and phase 2 trials for Prader-Willi syndrome with pitolisant. A phase 2 trial is also known as a proof of concept trial, or proof of concept study, or a signal detection study. Basically, what you're doing in that kind of trial is you're obtaining preliminary data on whether the drug has the potential to work. That is there a signal? And in our case, I'll tell you about that in a moment. We did see a signal, but the idea is that if the drug appears to be efficacious, that is, there is a signal, and it's safe in a small number of patients, like you do in a phase 2 trial, you then move forward to the larger phase 3 trials, which are in which that data is then used to support your application to the FDA to get the drug approved. So we are now at the phase 3 level, as our phase 2 study did show a positive signal, that is, people with Prader-Willi syndrome were improving in terms of their degree of excessive daytime sleepiness, and that gave us enough confidence to move forward with a very large global phase 3 trial, which we call TEMPO. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go on here. So next slide. So the TEMPO study, this is that large phase 3 study that, if it is positive, we will use this study in support of getting pitolisant approved for patients with Prader-Willi syndrome. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the objectives of the study. We'll talk a little bit about very selected key inclusion criteria, because there are many, and just for lack of time, I can't go into all of those. And we'll also talk about selected key exclusion criteria, that is, the inclusion-exclusion criteria that's necessary to participate in this study. I'll give you a little bit about the study highlights, and then I'll turn it back over to Rachel, and she'll give you a little info about where the clinical trial sites are located in the United States. Next slide. Okay. So what are the objectives of the TEMPO study? Well, the primary objective is to evaluate the impact of pitolisant, again, a medication that increases histamine levels in the brain, in treating excessive daytime sleepiness in people with Prader-Willi syndrome. In addition to that primary main objective, we're also evaluating what we call secondary objectives. Those include the severity of irritability, that is, does pitolisant help in controlling and treating irritability, severity of disruptive behaviors, and hyperphagia. Again, in our phase 2 trial, we did see some signals pointing in a direction that give us some degree of confidence that we may see some improvements in our phase 3 trial. But that, again, remains to be seen. We've got to finish the trial and enroll it, and then we'll review all that data. Next slide. So some of the a few key inclusion criteria in terms of participating in the TEMPO trial. You've got to be 6 years old at the time of screening, male or female. You have to have a genetic confirmation in terms of the diagnosis of PWS. You have to have a certain degree of excessive daytime sleepiness at the screening and at what we call the baseline, which are the visits before you actually get medication. And there has to be a consistent parent or caregiver involved, preferably the same person throughout the study. So those are just sort of, again, this is not an all-inclusive list, but some of the key features in terms of inclusion. And next slide. And some of the selected key exclusion criteria include if you've previously taken pitolisant, you would not be eligible to participate. If you have a diagnosis of sleep apnea, either obstructive sleep apnea or central sleep apnea, that's not adequately controlled, you would not be able to participate. If you are involved in another investigational research trial, taking an investigational medicine within the last 30 days of being screened, you would not be allowed to participate. If you are not on a stable dose of whatever current medication you're on, or if you're unable to discontinue certain prohibited medications because they're required, for health, then you would not be eligible. And if you experience less than the required amount of sleep per night, which is based on the person's age and the data that's collected during the screening period in an e-diary. What we're trying to avoid here is enrolling patients in the study that are basically sleep deprived. We we want patients enrolled in this trial who have excessive daytime sleepiness related to Prader-Willi syndrome, not to something else like sleep deprivation or sleep apnea or things of that nature. Next slide. Just in terms of some of the key highlights, the study is looking for approximately 134 participants that will be randomized globally. That, you know, we've got sites across the United States, but we'll also be doing this study in Europe and Canada and Australia. But about 60 participants will be from the United States. As I said earlier, an active caregiver and an active caregiver participating in the trial is required to be enrolled. And the duration, the overall study participation is expected to be about 4 to 6 months, with an option then to continue into what we call an open label extension trial, where patients actually get the real medication, get real pitolisant, and not a placebo. Next slide. So just a couple things about the study design. So there's a screening and baseline period where you basically have a certain period of time to meet eligibility, and it could be up to 45 days. That's followed by what we call a treatment period, where you are randomized or randomly assigned to either pitolisant or placebo. And I'll tell you in a moment that that dose of pitolisant that you're getting is based on your weight, not your age. And that period, it goes on for 11 weeks. And I'll give you a little bit more detail about the treatment period in the next slide. But as I had mentioned, that is then followed by an open label extension period where you get real pitolisant, no placebo, no chance of getting a placebo, and that goes on for a year. And then there's a follow-up period, of course, once you come off of pitolisant, just to be sure that there's no residual effects of the medication. Next slide. So again, just looking at that 11-week double-blind treatment period, double-blind meaning the participant and the caregiver and the principal investigator and his or her staff have no idea whether the participant is getting pitolisant or placebo. So they're blinded. They cannot see what they're getting. And as I said, the study drug is the amount administered is going to be based on weight, which is a little different from our phase 2 trial where it was based on age. And of course, the caregiver or parent, whoever that may be, will be involved in administering the medication to the participant. And basically, study participants will be taking that first dose of drug on day 1 in the morning, and then that will continue through the 11-week period every morning upon awakening. And again, they may be getting pitolisant or they may be getting placebo. Nobody knows. And the idea is that the participant just takes the medication and we see what happens. And there will be a number of assessments over the course of the study that the study team will be evaluating to kind of get a sense of and measure how well the patients are responding to whatever they're taking and whether they're having any side effects. Just to give you an idea that really the study is pretty user-friendly. There's a telehealth visit on day 22, and then there's only 3 once they're in the double-blind treatment period. There's only 3 in-person visits at day 29, day 57, and day 77. So it's not like you have to come in every week. They're spread apart almost about a month or so in between those those in-person visits. And then on day 77, at the end of the 11 weeks, the person will then be reassessed in terms of their eligibility to then enter into the open label extension. And that's pretty much the summary of the treatment period in a nutshell. And that's all that I have. And I'll hand this back over to Rachel.
Thanks, David. I appreciate it. We are so very close to having all US sites currently open. So close. But we have a lot of sites open. So that sort of dark purplish color that you see there are the sites that are currently open and recruiting. So you do not have to live in one of these states to participate in the trial. We do have a financial assistance program where we will cover the cost of your travel accommodations to participate in the clinical trial. You also do not have to be a patient of the doctor that is the primary principal investigator of the trial. So if you see a site that's close to you in a geographical area and you're interested, you can absolutely pursue that. But if you also see a site that you maybe are interested in spending some time in, if that's Santa Monica, California, or someplace like that, you can also contact that site. We have 3 sites that are, as I mentioned, very close to being open in Baltimore, Maryland, Rochester, Minnesota, and Cleveland, Ohio. But we are working hard to get those open. So thank you guys very much for your time. David and I are happy to stay on the line, take any questions that you all have. And I will flash this slide one more time. You can always reach out to anyone on our team. So you can get me. I'm the head of patient advocacy and engagement here at Harmony at advocacy@harmonybiosciences.com. The best way to ask a question directly about the trial is to email Anne at clinicaltrials@harmonybiosciences.com. And if you take a screenshot of the QR code or use the QR code, that will take you to the tempopwsstudy.com website, and you can learn more information there. So thank you again, and happy to stay and chat.
Thank you so much, Rachel and David. We really appreciate it. We do have quite a few questions in the Q&A. So it looks like some of them, David, you answered in the presentation. We had a couple of questions which we always get, what age do kiddos have to be to participate in the trial? And do they have to have a diagnosis of another diagnosis of a sleep disorder of some sort in order to qualify, or is PWS enough? But it looks like you took care of all of that. So I'm going to get into some of the other questions. We have a question asking, because pitolisant affects histamine and dopamine, are there concerns about increased anxiety and behavior? And also, can you address any potential cardiovascular issues?
Mm-hmm. So let me first talk about the histamine issue. So yes, this is a medication that increases histamine levels in the brain, but doesn't increase peripheral histamine. It acts through a specific receptor in the brain called the histamine 3 receptor. And because of that, we don't really expect any significant histamine type of symptoms. It's as I said, it's histamine focused, but histamine focused in the central nervous system. So that's one part of the question. The other part of the question is, are there any cardiovascular issues? Pitolisant is a very well tolerated medication. It's been on the market for many years for a different indication, but an indication that also has significant daytime sleepiness as part of its syndrome. And as I said, very well tolerated. There is in the package insert, there is a section that says it could potentially prolong something called the QT interval. If you know anything about EKGs, It's a specific measurement on an EKG. It's a pretty low risk for doing that, but we as some of in terms of exclusionary medications, if someone is on a drug, let's say that we know prolongs the QT interval, that probably wouldn't be something that we would like to have in the study. Or if somebody has a family history of something called a long QT syndrome, that would be, and if you have that disorder, you probably know that. And that would be someone that wouldn't be, eligible to participate either. So those are kind of the issues that we think about from a cardiovascular standpoint. And what were the other ones, Dorothy? Was there some other part of the question that I missed?
No, I think you addressed both of the questions there. We definitely have more for you though.
Okay.
Um, could you explain how this works differently than stimulants like Ritalin?
Yes, it's a good question. So stimulants fall into this class of medication. We call them sympathomimetics. That is, they sort of increase the sympathetic nervous system, which it controls blood pressure and pulse and things of that nature. Many of the stimulants fall into the amphetamine class of medications. This medication, pitolacin, is a non-sympathomimetic, non-amphetamine. In fact, it's the only wake-promoting agent that is currently approved by the FDA that is not a controlled substance. So you don't need a special prescription to get the medication like you do if you're taking a stimulant like Adderall or something like that, or any of those other wake-promoting medications.
Thank you. That's great. Okay, can this cause can I hope I'm reading this right. Can this cause of affect some of the already prevalent GI issues in PWS?
We don't expect much in the way of gastrointestinal symptoms with this medication. Like I said, it's been around for quite some time, and that's really not one of the more common side effects that you may see. Some of the more common side effects that we see. Let me go back to I just remembered the anxiety part of that last question. Let me talk about that in a minute. So some of the more common side effects with pitolacin include headache, and some people actually get a degree of insomnia because it is a wake promoting medication. Not most don't, but it can occur, just like headaches can occur. Most people don't have that side effect. And we have had some patients experience some anxiety, but again, a small percentage of patients. And interestingly, in our phase 2 signal detection study, one of the assessments that we did in that trial was something called the Aberrant Behavioral Checklist, the ABC. Some of you may be familiar with that. And we actually saw improvements in many of these behavioral domains on the ABC. And in fact, one of our actually key secondary endpoints that we're studying to see if there's improvement is actually irritability, which is obviously a significant issue in people with Prader-Willi. That's part of the whole temper tantrum issue. So from that standpoint, we're hoping to actually see some improvements in those behaviors. Again, we need to study this in this large phase 3 trial, but we did see some positive signals in our phase 2 trial that has sort of led us down that path. So
Great.
to be determined.
Okay. Okay, can individuals that live in group homes participate knowing that there may be 2 to 3 caregivers who are reporting?
Rachel, you want to talk about that, or you want me?
No, I can start and then
Yeah.
feel free to jump in, Dave. So the group home setting is actually something we've thought about a lot during the trial. The answer is yes. Individuals that live in a group home can participate. But what I will say is that the consistent caregiver that Dave mentioned as a part of the key inclusion criteria is really important. And so, there should be one main point of contact that is doing the reporting on the person that is in the clinical trial with Prader-Willi syndrome. And they have to only travel to, if you participate in a trial, Dave was talking about the visits schedule at the screening baseline, day 22, day 55. You have to travel with one consistent caregiver. So there are certainly ways that we can work this out for a group home, person living in a group home to participate, but it's something that you should talk about with when you go into the screening visit.
Okay. Just out of curiosity, if somebody's living in a group home and wants to participate, is that I mean, can they have that conversation before they go into a screening visit just to see
Oh,
if
yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, that's encouraged. They should do that.
Yes. So reach out to the study coordinator at the site that you're interested in, and that study coordinator at that site can have that conversation with you. Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah. And I mean, we understand that things happen. There's sometimes you can't get to your visit, or there's a problem with, maybe the caregiver gets sick or something. I mean, those sorts of issues can be worked out over the course of the study with the principal investigator and that person's staff. But we understand that those things happen. Having said that, it is important to have one primary caregiver, essentially, for the trial. But things do happen that are out of people's control. But that is important, because having too many people, report what's going on about their child, let's say, it becomes a little problematic. That you sort of lose consistency, and then the data is not exactly as straightforward as you would like it to be.
Understood. Okay. How do you differentiate between excessive daytime sleepiness and narcolepsy?
So that's a good question, and it's very interesting, because patients who have Prader-Willi syndrome, and because the hypothalamus is affected in Prader-Willi syndrome, these patients with the disorder can actually have features that look very much like narcolepsy. In fact, we call this a narcolepsy-like phenotype, or the picture of narcolepsy. But it's not narcolepsy. But it looks very much like narcolepsy, and there can be a lot of similar symptoms. So it's important to, and this will be discussed with the principal investigator at the screening visit and during that screening period, in terms of whether or not we're talking about narcolepsy or Prader-Willi syndrome. My general approach to this is that if you have Prader-Willi syndrome and you have sleepiness, it's very difficult. In fact, I would say you can't make a diagnosis of narcolepsy, because narcolepsy is a diagnosis that exists without having any other potential causes for narcolepsy. So if you've got Prader-Willi syndrome, it's very difficult to make it. But sometimes these two, sleepiness and Prader-Willi and narcolepsy, get confused. Sometimes patients with Prader-Willi syndrome carry a diagnosis of narcolepsy. Whether that's actually a accurate diagnosis, I think there's potentially some could be questioned. So, but all of these sorts of issues would be, if this is applicable to any given person, these would be addressed at the screening, during the screening period, not the screening visit. And oftentimes the principal investigators are reaching out to me, and we're having these conversations to determine, whether that would be a good person to participate.
Thank you. Is there a reason as to why the dose was changed based on age to the dose being based on weight between the phase 2 and the phase 3 trial?
Yes. I mean, part of the reasoning for that is that, of course, many patients with Prader-Willi syndrome may be overweight, and therefore may not be appropriate for, let's say, that patient to have a lower dose based on their age. They may need a higher dose. And in fact, from data that came from our phase 2 study, we sort of noticed that a particular milligram per kilogram amount seemed to be more effective than not. So we want to try to get patients up to that sort of cutoff where we think that they're going to do better or get benefit from the medication.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Are there prohibited medications
Which,
for exclusion?
which, by the way, Dorothy, I'm sorry to interrupt.
It's okay.
That's how most pediatric medications are administered, on a milligram per kilogram, weight-based kind of.
Well, I mean, you are correct. The last time my son was sick and I had to just give him Tylenol, it's based on
Yeah, it's based on weight.
based on weight. So
Yeah.
it makes perfect sense. Our next question is, what are prohibited medications for exclusion? Do you have a list?
Well, there is a list which you would go through in great detail at the screening visit. But and there's a whole number of them. For example, certain antihistamines are not allowed, but certain antihistamines are allowed. Drugs that might prolong the QT interval, as I mentioned earlier, would not be allowed. Those sorts of things. But there's a specific list that you would
So
review with your investigator. Yeah.
just to kind of piggyback on that, is that a list that could be provided to someone before the screening visit? So, for example, if someone has to travel to go to their screening visit, but their kiddo might be on a medication that would preclude them from, partaking in the trial, would they have that information prior
Well,
to?
yes, they would. What many of the sites do is they do what's something called pre-screening, like something over the phone, just to get a general sense of the medications that they're already taking, and a little bit of history. It just helps determine whether that person should actually come into the office or not.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm looking at another question. I just want to make sure that I understand it before I try to ask it. Also, could there be several drugs worked on at a time? I see we're looking into hyperphagia on top. Okay, I'm gonna read it as it stands. Could there be several drugs worked on at a time? I see that we are looking into hyperphagia on top of EDS.
Well, I'm not sure what they mean by that question, but a
Not
couple of things.
100%.
A couple of things. If you're talking about participating in two clinical trials, one that's looking at hyperphagia and one that's looking at pitolisant, no, you cannot do that. You have to finish one. Usually there's a washout period. It's about 30 days. Then you could come into the next trial. And the idea behind, and if, let's say, someone is taking a medication that's treating their hyperphagia, for example. Okay, I know that may or may not be an issue coming to fruition soon. Once that medication is on the market, there may be an opportunity to actually then also participate in the trial, as long as the medication is stable. The idea is that medications need to be stable, before you come into a clinical trial. You don't want to be adding or taking away medications or changing doses of the medications that you're already on before you come into a clinical trial, because then it's hard to determine what, is if let's say a side effect occurs related to that. Then there's it becomes a more difficult determination as to whether it's the drug that we're studying, the pitolacin. Is that the reason for the side effect? Is it because a new drug was added, or so it introduces confounding issues.
Got it.
So
So
I
if
think
if there's an approved drug that someone is taking and they have
and it's
stabilized
stable.
and stabilized taking that medication, then there is potentially an opportunity for them
Yes,
to see if this would help.
as long as
Yeah.
it's not a prohibited medication.
Got it. Okay. This next question is a little tricky, and I know that we can't name names, so I'm going to stay away from that. Um, so I'm just work with me as I rephrase the question to make sure that we maintain anonymity. Um, could there be consideration given to extend the open label extension? Um, it appears that the open label extension ends in August, and for a family who's had uh, tremendous benefit from this medication, uh, there's some anxiety about the idea of maybe having to stop taking the medication if open label ends in August.
Well, there's no specific time that open label it will end. It will end based on, the patient can be on the medication for the open label extension is for 52 weeks.
Okay.
Now, depending on where things are at that point, um, this is really not something I can answer because I don't have an answer. Uh, Honestly, I don't know if Rachel has any more information, but I don't have any information as to, once the open label is finished, what's going to happen there. As it stands now, once the open label is finished, it's finished.
I
Whether
think from
that
our perspective, we're now kind of starting to see some patients that entered into the study earlier in 2024 that are coming up to the end of the open label period. And it's something that we actually are considering what will happen next. So I would say stay tuned and also feel free to reach out to me, and I will feel free to reach out to me at the Harmony team, and happy to have those conversations.
Perfect.
or Ann
Or
Nabi,
Anne, correct.
who's actually sort of the director of the trial. She may have some more information on this.
Thank
Correct.
you for the inquiring minds for that previous question. You now have some direction where you can go, and hopefully this helps. Okay, we have more questions, guys. Is there a reason why the age of this trial starts at 6? We get this a lot.
My understanding is I think it's just a general cutoff where the FDA sort of has these sort of standard sort of cutoffs for ages. For example, once you're older than 6, once you hit 65, you're then in a different class. Now you're in quote unquote the elderly class. Between 18 and 65 would be considered adults. Then you've got an adolescent and children. I think it's just a sort of a general cutoff that's been used. It was also the cutoff that we used for our phase 2 trial, so we're just trying to be consistent in moving forward.
That makes sense. And the FDA does that quite a bit with research in the pediatric space,
Yeah.
especially in rare disease.
Yeah, and the other thing is, which may have been one of the reasons that maybe even before I joined Harmony, because the phase 2 trial, was, I think, started back in 2018 when it first commenced. So it was quite a while ago. But if that there are, when you look at people with Prader-Willi syndrome, there's a spectrum. Things change over time, and the kinds of that are occurring change as a person ages. So, for example, hyperphagia may not be a significant issue until a person gets a little older. maybe not such a big deal in infancy, where there may be sort of, in earlier childhood, you're dealing with, more like failure to thrive type issues. So
Hmm.
the point is things change, and that's true for many of the symptoms.
Right.
So I think, choosing a consistent, age, where we believe, particular symptoms may or may not be starting and continuing on, that sort of might have been one of the reasons why age 6 was chosen. But I have a feeling it was more sort of a regulatory kind of a thing.
I would
Yeah.
I would tend to agree.
Yeah.
I have there's a few more questions if we just have a few more minutes. And I have a question here that says, what's the drug's half-life? I'm wondering if that question was supposed to be what's the drug's shelf life, or did I miss the mark on that?
Well, it could have been Half-Life.
Okay.
It's about it's somewhere in the range of about between 10 to 20 hours, probably closer to around maybe 12, something like that.
So can you just, for those of us who are listening like me who don't really understand what half-life means, would you describe
So
that a little bit?
yeah, so what that means is that over that period of time, half of the drug has been metabolized and is no longer, let's say, circulating. There's
Okay.
no, the concentration of the drug is now half of what it was.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And it looks like we have clarification to a question that you already answered. And this was an individual who meant to ask, um, or state and then ask that this trial is for EDS, but it's also looking at the effects that it might have on hyperphagia. Can you get into a little bit of what that looks like?
Yes. The primary endpoint and what you must have in order to be eligible is some degree of excessive daytime sleepiness based on certain measurements that would be taken during the screening period. Um, Now, in terms of as I said, we're also looking at symptoms like irritability,
Mhm.
um, and hyperphagia, for example. And we are looking to see if pitolisant will improve those particular symptoms, but you don't need to have some degree of hyperphagia or some degree of irritability to actually participate in the trial. There's no assessment for that. But if you happen to have it, we will be monitoring to see if pitolisant helps.
So I'm going to bring up a question here just because this is something that I've seen in our community, and a good number of individuals with PWS around the age where your enrollment in this trial starts. So pitolisant is again approved to treat narcolepsy with cataplexy. And there are individuals who have PWS who have kind of um, cataplexy type episodes, if you
Mhm.
will. So if you're a parent and you're on the fence, but let's say your kid just exhibits, let's say they go into a laughing fit, right? And then fall to the ground and then get up and then laugh, 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 fall to the ground again repeatedly and have those type of episodes. Um, is Would it be worth it for those parents to maybe have their child evaluated for this drug?
That's the one particular symptom of narcolepsy, that is cataplexy, which is
Hmm.
a state of hypotonia or low muscle function that occurs in the setting of strong emotion.
Hmm.
It's a pathognomonic feature of something called narcolepsy with cataplexy, and that cataplectic attack. Pathognomonic means if you see it, you can make the diagnosis
Get it on video, record
of,
it.
of narcolepsy. So that's the one sort of caveat, that if patients have Prader-Willi and are having significant cataplexy, My general feeling on that is that I still believe patients have Prader-Willi syndrome, and I'm not sure you could make the diagnosis of narcolepsy. However, having said that, um, that's a little bit of a gray area. Um, and I guess it's possible for somebody to have two disorders, right?
Right.
Prader-Willi syndrome and narcolepsy. You try to be parsimonious and have one diagnosis in medicine, but if that particular symptom is present, it becomes a little bit more of a gray area. So this is exactly the kind of case that the principal investigator would have a discussion with me. We've had a few discussions about this in some patients. It doesn't come up that frequently, but occasionally it does, and we'd have to kind of determine whether we think the person who's experiencing these symptoms would be a good candidate. The reason we go through this whole rigmarole is because when we present our data to the FDA is going to tell us, well, we want to make sure you haven't included patients that have narcolepsy. We've already approved you for narcolepsy. We're looking for the approval for patients who have daytime sleepiness and Prader-Willi syndrome. So it could become an FDA issue for us. So we want to be careful that we enroll, patients who are experiencing excessive daytime sleepiness related to Prader-Willi syndrome.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that clarification. Last and final question, looks like, regarding participants for phase 3, how close are you to hitting your limit, and what happens if you don't get enough participants? When will your phase 3 enrollment close?
Well, as it stands today, of the 134 patients that we need, we have 19 in the study. So we have a long way to go. And we're going to
Worldwide, correct?
worldwide, although we don't have our European sites up and running yet. We have one Australian site up and running. We're close to getting some of the European sites up, but we still have we're still in the phase where we're just getting the sites started. So there's still plenty of time to to enroll in the study.
And for those of you who are listening and watching today, getting those sites off the ground is a business. It takes a minute, so there is definitely some time.
It's not easy. We have to be
Rachel looks
sure.
like she wants to talk.
No, no, I would just say, we would, as a goal, because I heard the person ask, what happens if you don't get enough participants? I mean, we're gonna keep working, we're gonna get there. But as a company goal, we would like to try to get the rest of those 100 or so participants by the end of this year. So if you're thinking about, what might be a good time for your family, if that's summertime when school's out, or when might be the right time to start, I highly encourage you to reach out and talk to a site too about when might be the right time to do a screening visit, because we would like to work to do this trial this year.
Yes, I mean, I mentioned that number because I don't want to discourage people to say, oh, they're almost done with their trial. We're not almost done with their trial. So, but we do encourage you to get, if you want to participate, get the ball rolling.
Perfect. Okay, well, great. I don't see any other questions in the Q&A. So I think I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank you, David and Rachel, for taking so much time with our community this evening. We're really excited to have you in our space and just love having you as a partner with the PWS community. And folks, if there are any other questions that you have, I believe that Rachel put some information out. You can always check out the website. You can reach out to PWSA. You can reach out to myself or Stacy or Lynn or anybody else here at PWSA. We'll be happy to connect you. And I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. And again, thank you so much, Harmony. We love you guys.
Thank you, Dorothea. We're
Pleasure.
Yeah, love working with you guys. We look forward to seeing so many of you in June in Arizona. We're so excited to go to such a big PWS gathering.
Oh, wait, hold on. Time out, guys. There's another question that just popped up. I love our community. Okay, hold on. I have to keep names out of this. There's an individual whose child has PWS and narcolepsy with cataplexy. Are we saying that the trial is more for daytime sleepiness and not specifically for narcolepsy with cataplexy, since we already know this is that diagnosis?
It is not a narcolepsy with cataplexy clinical trial. It's a Prader-Willi syndrome clinical
Yes.
trial.
Yep. Thank you.
So if that person has a formal diagnosis of narcolepsy with cataplexy, um, whether or not they could participate, I think would be questionable. We'd have to really kind of think about that, get as much history as we can. I say we, I'm really talking about the principal investigator who would then, reach out to me. Um, Number one, number two, Pitocin is available for children, um, with excessive daytime sleepiness and narcolepsy. It's available. It's commercialized, but again, whether or not that particular person would qualify, I think it's gonna require a little bit of investigation and analysis to make that determination. But it's not totally out of the question. But like I said, it becomes that specific instance becomes a little bit of a gray area.
So to the parent who asked that question, if you have a diagnosis of narcolepsy with cataplexy, looks like you might be able to get this medication with that diagnosis. But if you're not sure if you have that diagnosis, and your child does have PWS, I would suggest going ahead and at least getting evaluated for this trial, and let the investigator determine whether or not there is an official diagnosis of narcolepsy with cataplexy, or if this is a PWS related issue.
Yeah.
And
I think
then
that's a good idea.
at least that way, you've looked at this from every angle, and Harmony can determine, which is the best course of action, and make sure that if you're able to enroll your child in the study, that it's actually for this study, and that it wouldn't skew the data in any way. So that's great.
Yes, well said, Dorothea.
Okay. And with that, we're done. No more questions, guys. If you no, it really, if you do have questions, go ahead and send them to us. You can email myself or Stacy, or Rachel, at Harmony. And thank you so much. Oh my God, there's another question.
Okay, let's do it.
Uh,
One more. How's that?
if a child fits the criteria expected age, is there any way around? I'm guessing if the child doesn't fit the criteria expected age, is there any way around the age?
Not really. You have to wait till they're the right age.
Not does, yeah. I'm right. Guys,
Yeah.
I know we like to live in gray, but there's some things we can't. All
Yeah,
right, we're done.
clinical trials need to be a little more black and white.
They they they
It's just
do.
the nature of it.
Yeah. But guys, we can continue to have some more conversations offline and ask any other additional questions. And again, the trial's open and sites are enrolling, so we can ask the investigators at the trial sites also. So just again, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, David. Thank you, Stacy. And I hope everybody has a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Right. Thanks, everyone.